On a cold November morning in 1847, at a county courthouse auction in Lexington, Kentucky, an auctioneer stood on the steps holding a tattered piece of paper and announced the sale of an enslaved girl, approximately 16 years old, described in the auction notice as consumptive, near death, of no labor value. The bidding opened at 50 cents. No one bid. The auctioneer dropped it to 25 cents. Still nothing. Finally, at 19 cents, the price of a loaf of bread, a plantation owner named Edmund Fairchild raised his hand, more out of morbid curiosity about why anyone would bother auctioning a dying slave than any actual interest in owning her. He paid his 19 cents, signed the bill of sale, and had the girl loaded onto a wagon with a load of supplies. He didn't even ask her name. She was so thin that she weighed less than 80 pounds. She coughed blood into a rag. The auctioneer told Edmund she probably wouldn't survive the week, and Edmund shrugged. 19 cents was less than he'd paid for his morning coffee. What Edmund Fairchild didn't know was that the dying girl he'd just purchased for the price of a loaf of bread was carrying a secret that would destroy his reputation, tear apart his family, expose crimes he'd committed 15 years earlier, and force him to make an impossible choice between his social standing and his soul. This is the story of how a 19-cent purchase became the most expensive thing Edmund Fairchild ever bought. Before we begin, I need to warn you, this story contains descriptions of sexual violence, child exploitation, death, and the brutal commodification of human beings. This is documented history that reveals how the system of slavery created situations where fathers could unknowingly buy and sell their own children. If you're ready, stay with me. Edmund Fairchild was born in 1798 to a moderately wealthy Virginia family. By the time he was 30, he had built a successful tobacco plantation in Kentucky through a combination of shrewd business dealings, strategic marriages, and ruthless exploitation of enslaved labor. He owned approximately 120 enslaved people by 1847, and he had a reputation in Lexington society as a respectable, church-going gentleman who treated his slaves humanely, which meant he didn't whip them publicly and provided slightly better food than legally required. But Edmund had secrets. In 1832, when he was 34 years old and his plantation was still being established, he had purchased a young enslaved woman named Clara from a Virginia estate sale. Clara was 18, described in sale records as mulatto, skilled in domestic service, of pleasant demeanor. Within months of her arrival, Edmund began raping her regularly. This was not unusual for plantation owners. It was so common that it was barely remarked upon. What made Edmund's actions particularly calculated was that when Clara became pregnant in early 1833, Edmund sold her away while she was still in her first trimester, before the pregnancy became visible, to a slave trader heading to the Deep South. Edmund did this for two reasons. First, he was newly married to a woman named Margaret from a prominent Lexington family, and he didn't want evidence of his sexual exploitation of enslaved women creating tension in his household. Second, and more cynically, selling Clara pregnant meant he got full price for a healthy young woman without having to feed and house her through pregnancy and childbirth, and without having to wait years to profit from the child's labor or sale. Clara was sold to a cotton plantation in Louisiana. She gave birth to a daughter in September of 1833. The daughter was named Ruth by the enslaved community that helped Clara through childbirth, though plantation records simply listed her as Clara's girl, mulatto. Clara died when Ruth was 6 years old, from injuries sustained during a whipping for taking food to feed her starving daughter. Ruth was sold multiple times over the following years: Louisiana to Mississippi at age 7, Mississippi to Tennessee at age 10, Tennessee to Kentucky at age 14. By the time Ruth was 16 in 1847, she had been enslaved on 7 different plantations. She had been beaten, starved, overworked, and exploited in ways that left her body broken. And she had contracted tuberculosis, a death sentence in 1847. The plantation that owned her in 1847 didn't want to pay for her burial, so they sent her to a county courthouse auction, hoping to get anything at all for her before she died. They got 19 cents. Edmund Fairchild brought Ruth back to his plantation and had her taken to the small infirmary building where enslaved people too sick to work were kept until they either recovered or died. He didn't visit her. He didn't think about her again. She was a curiosity purchase, worth less than the administrative effort to record her in his ledger. Ruth was cared for by an elderly enslaved woman named Patience who ran the infirmary. Patience had delivered babies, set broken bones, and sat with dying people for 40 years. She knew Ruth was dying. Tuberculosis in its advanced stages was unmistakable. The bloody cough, the wasting away, the fever that never broke. Patience gave Ruth what comfort she could, a clean pallet to sleep on, broth when she could swallow it, cool water for her fever, and someone to sit with her so she wouldn't die alone. For 3 weeks, Ruth said almost nothing. She was too weak to speak much, and she had learned through years of slavery that words were dangerous. But as she grew weaker and realized death was approaching, she began to talk. She told Patience about her mother Clara. She described the plantations she'd been sold through. She talked about the things she'd seen and endured. And then, in her 4th week at Edmund Fairchild's plantation, Ruth said something that made Patience go completely still. Ruth told Patience that her mother Clara had, in the months before she died, told Ruth who her father was. Clara had described the plantation in detail, described the man who had raped her repeatedly, and told Ruth his name, Edmund Fairchild. Clara had made Ruth memorize it, had told her that if she ever had the chance, she should let him know what had become of the daughter he had created and discarded. Patience didn't know if Ruth was telling the truth, hallucinating from fever, or simply creating a story to give her life some meaning before death. But Patience had been on Edmund Fairchild's plantation for 23 years, since 1824, which meant she had been there in 1832 when Clara arrived, and in early 1833 when Clara was suddenly sold away. Patience remembered Clara. She remembered that Clara had been visibly favored by Edmund for several months, and then one day she was just gone, sold without warning. And now here was a 16-year-old girl who looked like she could be Clara's daughter, dying in the infirmary, claiming to be Edmund Fairchild's child. Patience made a decision. She went to Edmund and told him that the girl he'd bought for 19 cents wanted to speak with him before she died. Edmund was annoyed. He was busy, and he saw no reason to waste time on a dying slave he'd purchased as a curiosity. But Patience persisted, and finally, out of irritation more than any genuine interest, Edmund walked to the infirmary. What happened in that infirmary was documented in 2 sources that survived: Edmund's private journal, discovered in an attic in 1923, and testimony from Patience given in an 1866 legal proceeding. Both sources describe essentially the same scene. Ruth was propped up on pillows, barely able to sit upright, blood staining the cloth she held to her mouth. When Edmund entered, she looked directly at him and said, "Do you remember a woman named Clara? Mulatto, 18 years old, purchased in Virginia in 1832, sold away pregnant in early 1833. Edmund froze. He hadn't thought about Clara in years, but he remembered her. More importantly, he remembered selling her pregnant because he hadn't wanted the complication. He stared at Ruth, and for the first time, he actually looked at her features, at the shape of her face, at the light brown skin that matched what he remembered of Clara. According to Edmund's journal, Ruth told him, "I am the child Clara was carrying when you sold her. She died when I was 6. Before she died, she told me your name. She told me to remember what you did to her, what you did to me by creating me and throwing us both away like we were nothing. I have been enslaved my entire life. I have been beaten, starved, and worked until my body broke. I was sold 7 times. And now I'm dying of consumption at 16 years old, and I'm worth 19 cents. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to look at what you created and threw away. I wanted you to know that I'm your daughter, and you bought me for less than a loaf of bread." Edmund's journal entries from that night are remarkable for their mixture of guilt, horror, denial, and self-justification. He wrote that he initially didn't believe Ruth, that he convinced himself she was lying or confused, or that Patience had put her up to this for some reason. But he also wrote that he couldn't shake the resemblance, couldn't ignore the specific details Ruth knew about Clara, couldn't deny the timeline. Over the following days, Edmund visited Ruth multiple times. He questioned her extensively about Clara, about the plantations she'd been sold through, about her life. With each visit, Edmund became more convinced and more disturbed that Ruth was telling the truth. She was his daughter. He had raped her mother, sold her mother away pregnant, and now, 15 years later, he had unknowingly purchased his own dying daughter for 19 cents. According to Patience's testimony, Edmund asked Ruth what she wanted from him. Did she want to be freed? Did she want money? Did she want him to acknowledge her publicly as his daughter? Ruth's response, as recorded by both Edmund's journal and Patience's testimony, was devastating in its simplicity. She said, "I'm dying. I'll be dead in days, maybe a week. There's nothing you can give me now that matters. I didn't tell you this because I want something from you. I told you because I wanted you to carry it. I wanted you to know that when you sold my mother away pregnant, you didn't just destroy her life. You destroyed mine before I was even born. And I wanted you to know that every slave you own, every person you've bought and sold, is someone's child, maybe even your own." Ruth died 6 days later, on December 14, 1847. She was 16 years old. Edmund had her buried in the slave cemetery on his plantation, and he marked her grave with a simple wooden cross, unusual, because enslaved people's graves were typically unmarked. He didn't tend the burial. What happened next is where Edmund Fairchild's moral crisis becomes visible in the historical record. Edmund was faced with an impossible choice. He could acknowledge Ruth as his daughter, which would mean admitting to his wife Margaret that he had raped enslaved women, admitting to Lexington society that he had mixed-race children, potentially creating legal claims from other children he might have fathered with enslaved women, destroying his reputation as a respectable Christian gentleman, risking social exile from the circles that sustained his business and political influence. Or he could say nothing. Let Ruth be buried as just another unnamed enslaved person who died young, and carry the knowledge of what he'd done in silence. Edmund chose silence, publicly. But his private journal entries from late 1847 through 1849 reveal a man psychologically destroyed by what had happened. He wrote obsessively about Ruth, about Clara, about the other enslaved women he'd raped over the years, about how many other children he might have fathered and sold away without knowing. He questioned the entire system of slavery, questioned his own participation in it, questioned the Christianity he'd always claimed to follow. In 1848, Edmund did something highly unusual. He stopped purchasing enslaved people. He began, very quietly and gradually, allowing enslaved people on his plantation to purchase their freedom through extra labor, something almost unheard of in Kentucky at that time. Between 1848 and 1855, 23 enslaved people bought their freedom from Edmund's plantation, far more than any comparable plantation in the region. In 1850, Edmund wrote a will that contained a shocking provision. Upon his death, all enslaved people remaining on his plantation would be freed and given passage to Liberia or to free states in the north, along with a sum of money to start their lives. This was illegal under Kentucky law at the time, but Edmund had structured it through legal mechanisms that made it difficult to challenge. Edmund died in 1855 at age 57. The will was executed as written, though his widow Margaret and his legitimate children fought it fiercely. By 1858, after legal battles, 91 formerly enslaved people from the Fairchild plantation had been freed and relocated. The Fairchild family's wealth was significantly reduced by the legal fees and the loss of their enslaved labor force. Edmund's journal was discovered in 1923 by his great-granddaughter, a woman named Caroline Fairchild Monroe, who was researching family history. She found the journals in a trunk in her mother's attic. She spent 2 years deciding what to do with them. In 1925, she donated them to the Kentucky Historical Society with the stipulation that they not be published until after her death. She died in 1954. The journals were published in 1956 in a book titled The Conscience of a Slaveholder, The Private Journals of Edmund Fairchild. Patience's testimony came from a different source. In 1866, during Reconstruction, Patience was interviewed as part of a Freedmen's Bureau project documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people. She was asked if she remembered any particularly significant events from her time in slavery. She told the story of Ruth, of the 19-cent purchase, of the revelation in the infirmary, and of Edmund Fairchild's transformation afterward. Her account corroborated every major detail in Edmund's journals. The story of Ruth and Edmund Fairchild reveals multiple horrifying truths about slavery. First, that the system was so dehumanizing that a man could unknowingly purchase his own daughter for 19 cents because she had been so thoroughly reduced to property that familial connection was invisible. Second, that enslaved women's bodies were so thoroughly controlled that rape was routine and pregnancy was a calculable economic variable rather than a human event. Third, that enslaved children could be bought, sold, and discarded multiple times before they were even adults, accumulating trauma and physical destruction until they were worth less than a loaf of bread. But Ruth's story also reveals something about resistance and agency. Ruth, dying at 16, used the last days of her life to force her father to confront what he had done. She didn't ask for his money or his acknowledgement or his public remorse. She asked him to carry the knowledge. She weaponized the truth against him, and it destroyed him psychologically even as her body was dying. She took the power that slavery had stripped from her and her mother and used it to make one enslaver understand the full weight of his actions. Did Edmund's transformation after Ruth's death make up for what he'd done? No. Did freeing 91 people erase the years of enslavement they'd already suffered? Or the people he'd already sold away, or Clara's death, or Ruth's suffering? No. Edmund's guilty conscience doesn't redeem him. But what it does show is that even people deeply embedded in evil systems can be forced to see. That evil, when it's brought close enough, when it's made personal enough, when a dying 16-year-old girl looks them in the eye and says, "This is what you did." This is why we tell these stories. Because the 19-cent girl had a name, Ruth. Because her mother had a name, Clara. Because both of them mattered, even when the system said they were worth less than bread. Because resistance isn't always violent rebellion. Sometimes it's using your last breath to make your oppressor understand what they've done. Because even in systems designed to strip people of all agency, people found ways to speak truth to power. If this story moved you, subscribe to Buried Truths for more stories that reveal the full human cost of slavery. Comment below. What does Ruth's choice to tell Edmund the truth say about resistance? How do we understand Edmund's transformation? Is it redemption or just guilty conscience trying to buy peace? Share this with someone who needs to understand that enslaved people were daughters, sons, mothers, fathers, and that the system of slavery severed those bonds without even noticing. Ruth was worth 19 cents to the auction system. She was priceless to the truth. We're making sure her story is never buried again,